When Hawkins's training knife pressed against Sarah Chen's throat, 20 elite soldiers held their breath. This 140-pound, 5 feet 6 inches woman against America's toughest military instructor? What happened next would rewrite everything they thought they knew about warfare. How did this story begin? That moment when Sarah Chen first stepped into Colorado's Blackwater Ridge facility. Is this some kind of joke? Tank Morrison's 6 feet 4 inches frame cast a shadow over Sarah. His 19 elite teammates erupted in laughter. Looks like they sent us a librarian. Sarah said nothing, just stood there, calm and determined. But in 3 weeks, those same men would kneel before her, saying, "Please lead our team." Sarah Chen's combat boots crunched against the gravel of Blackwater Ridge training facility. The bus that carried her through 3 hours of winding Colorado mountain roads was already pulling away, leaving her standing alone with her duffel bag at the gates of America's most elite mercenary training compound. The facility stretched before her like something from a military thriller. Razor wire gleaming in the afternoon sun, concrete buildings that looked built to withstand a siege, and obstacle courses that seemed designed by someone with sadistic imagination. 20 men emerged from a nearby building, moving with the fluid confidence of apex predators. These weren't regular soldiers. Sarah could tell immediately. Everything about them screamed elite special operations. The way they carried themselves, the casual alertness in their eyes, the unconscious spacing they maintained that spoke of years in combat zones. Most were in their 30s, whether by deployments to places that didn't officially exist on any map. Tank Morrison, former SEAL Team 6, the giant introduced himself, not bothering to extend a hand. Sarah Chen, Army Intelligence, 82nd Airborne Division. She kept her voice level professional. Intelligence, Tank repeated, making the word sound like a disease. So you're the one who sat in air-conditioned trailers while we were getting shot at. Before Sarah could respond, a sharp whistle cut through the mountain air. The group immediately snapped to attention as a figure emerged from the main building. Chief Instructor Hawkins moved like a predator, all controlled power and barely contained violence. His reputation preceded him. 22 years as a Navy SEAL, including 8 with a legendary DevGru. The man had more confirmed kills than some small wars, and his pale blue eyes seemed to catalog every weakness in everyone he looked at. "Gentlemen," Hawkins announced, his voice carrying easily across the compound. "Welcome to Blackwater Ridge. For the next 8 weeks, this facility will either forge you into the kind of operators that governments pay millions for, or it will break you so completely that you'll be begging for a desk job at the Pentagon." His gaze swept across the assembled group, lingering for a moment on Sarah. "I see we have some diversity in this class. Let me be crystal clear about something. This isn't summer camp. This isn't sensitivity training. This is preparation for situations where political correctness gets you killed and good intentions get your teammates body bagged." Sarah felt the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on her. She'd faced hostile audiences before, briefing rooms full of skeptical colonels, interrogation sessions with captured insurgents, but this felt different. These men weren't just doubting her competence. They were actively hoping for her failure. "Half of you won't make it through week 1, Hawkins continued. "The other half will wish they hadn't. We'll be covering advanced combat tactics, weapon systems, hostage rescue, counterterrorism, and survival techniques that would make a Green Beret weep." Again, his eyes found Sarah. The message was clear. That evening, Sarah sat alone in the mess hall, picking at a meal that tasted like cardboard. Conversation stopped when she approached tables, resumed in hushed tones when she passed. She caught fragments: liability, political correctness, someone's going to get killed. Back in her Spartan room, she was laying out her gear when she noticed something white on the floor. A folded piece of paper had been slipped under her door. Sarah opened it to find a message written in block letters. "Save yourself the embarrassment. There's a bus leaving at 0600. She stared at the note for a long moment, then crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash. Have you ever been completely misjudged? Tell us in the comments. The alarm shrieked at 0430, cutting through Sarah's restless sleep like a blade. She'd barely managed 3 hours of unconsciousness, her mind churning over the anonymous note and the hostile faces from the day before. Around her, the other trainees were already moving with the efficient silence of professional soldiers. No groaning, no complaints. Just a quiet rustle of men who'd learned to function on minimal sleep in the world's worst places. The first formation was brutal in its simplicity. Hawkins appeared at exactly 0500, looking like he'd been awake for hours. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. "Today we separate the operators from the wannabes. First up, hand-to-hand combat assessment. I want to see what you're working with before I waste time trying to teach you anything." Sarah's stomach dropped. She'd hoped for a few days to acclimate, maybe some classroom instruction first. But Hawkins was clearly the type to throw his students into the deep end and see who could swim. The combat assessment took place in a gymnasium that looked like it had been designed by someone who enjoyed watching people suffer. Thick mats covered the floor, but Sarah could already see dark stains that suggested they'd absorbed plenty of blood over the years. Heavy bags hung from the ceiling like corpses, and the walls were lined with every type of training weapon imaginable. "Rodriguez Morrison, you're up first," Hawkins called out. 3-minute round, full contact. I want to see aggression, technique, and adaptability. Sarah watched as the two men squared off. Rodriguez was smaller than Tank, but moved like liquid mercury. His foot were precise and economical. Tank fought like his nickname suggested, a human battering ram who relied on overwhelming force. The match was brutal and beautiful, a chess game played with fists and elbows. Rodriguez's speed kept him competitive, but Tank's raw power eventually wore him down. "Acceptable," Hawkins said, making notes on his clipboard. "Rodriguez, work on your ground game. Morrison, you telegraph your right cross like you're sending a telegram. Chen, you're up next." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped onto the mat. Her opponent was a lean man named Stevens, a former Army Ranger with dead eyes and scars that told stories she didn't want to hear. He was maybe 6 feet tall, probably outweighed her by 60 pounds, and moved with the coiled tension of a snake ready to strike. "Don't worry, sweetheart," Stevens said as they touched gloves. "I'll try to be gentle." The condescension in his voice lit a fire in Sarah's chest. But before she could respond, Hawkins blew his whistle. Stevens came at her immediately. No feeling out process, no cautious circling. His first punch was a straight right that would have taken her head off if it had connected. Sarah slipped it by inches, feeling the wind from his fist brush her cheek. She tried to counter with a quick jab, but Stevens was already moving, his knee driving toward her ribs. Sarah twisted away, but not fast enough. The impact drove the air from her lungs and sent her stumbling backward. The watching men murmured appreciatively. First blood to Stevens. "Come on, Chun," Rodriguez called out. "Use your footwork." But Stevens wasn't giving her time to think. He pressed forward relentlessly, throwing combinations that forced Sarah to give ground. She managed to slip most of his punches, but the few that connected felt like sledgehammers. A left hook caught her on the temple, making her vision blur. An uppercut grazed her chin, snapping her head back. Sarah tried to create distance, to use her speed advantage, but the mat felt like it was shrinking around her. Stevens was herding her toward the wall, cutting off her angles. When her back hit the padding, she knew she was in trouble. Stevens smiled and threw a devastating right cross aimed at her solar plexus. Sarah saw it coming and tried to slip left, but there was nowhere to go. The punch caught her in the ribs with a sound like a baseball bat hitting a side of beef. Sarah's legs buckled and she dropped to one knee, gasping for air that wouldn't come. "Stay down," Stevens advised, standing over her. "No shame in knowing when you're beat." The gymnasium fell silent, except for Sarah's labored breathing. She could feel the weight of 20 pairs of eyes, could practically hear their thoughts. She doesn't belong here. This was a mistake. Someone's going to get killed. But as Sarah knelt on the mat, something crystallized in her mind. She thought about the note under her door, about Tank's sneering comments, about the way these men looked at her like she was a liability waiting to happen. The anger that had been simmering since she arrived suddenly blazed into something white-hot and pure. Sarah pushed herself to her feet, her ribs screaming in protest. Stevens looked surprised. Most people stayed down after a shot like that. "Round's not over," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. The remaining 90 seconds were a nightmare of controlled violence. Stevens, perhaps overconfident now, became more aggressive. throwing wider punches that left him momentarily exposed. Sarah couldn't match his power, but she was faster, and desperation made her creative. She started targeting his lead leg with quick kicks, trying to slow him down. When he threw a wild haymaker, she ducked under it and drove an elbow into his floating ribs. Stevens grunted and grabbed her in a clinch, using his weight advantage to drive her backward. Sarah felt his hands going for a takedown and knew that if this fight went to ground, it was over. In desperation, she drove her knee upward, catching Stevens in the thigh just above his protective cup. It wasn't a legal shot, but it was close enough to make him loosen his grip. Sarah broke free and backpedaled, her lungs burning. Stevens was limping slightly now, favoring his left leg. For the first time since the fight started, Sarah saw uncertainty in his eyes. She pressed forward, throwing quick combinations that forced him to defend. A left hook caught him on the ear, making him stumble. A right cross split his lip, drawing the first blood of the match. The buzzer sounded just as Stevens was setting up for another takedown attempt. Both fighters stepped back, breathing hard and bleeding. Sarah's left eye was swelling shut. Her ribs felt like they were on fire, and she could taste copper in her mouth, but she was still standing. "Interesting," Hawkins said, his expression unreadable. "Stevens, sloppy work in the second half. You let emotion override technique." "Chen," he paused, studying her with those pale blue eyes. "You've got heart, I'll give you that. But heart doesn't stop bullets, and it doesn't win fights against trained killers." Next up, Hawkins called out, consulting his clipboard. "Chun, you're going again, this time against Morrison." Tank Morrison stepped onto the mat with a grin that promised pain. He outweighed her by at least 80 pounds, and unlike Stevens, he wouldn't underestimate her. Nothing personal, Tank said as they touched gloves. But someone needs to teach you that this isn't a game. Have you ever had to prove yourself against impossible odds? 3 weeks into the program, Sarah was a walking catalog of injuries. Bruised ribs that made breathing an adventure, a shoulder that popped ominously when she raised her arm, and a collection of cuts and bruises that painted her skin in shades of purple and yellow. But something fundamental had changed. It began with small observations, tiny adjustments that most people wouldn't notice. During morning PT, she watched Tank lumber through the obstacle course like a freight train, powerful but predictable. His massive frame made certain movements inevitable. He had to duck lower under barriers, took wider turns around corners, and always favored his right side when climbing. Sarah filed these details away like intelligence reports, building tactical profiles of every man in her class. The breakthrough came during a grappling session with Williams, a wiry former Marine Force recon operator who'd been systematically choking out half the class. Williams was technical, patient, and had about 30 pounds on Sarah. In their previous encounters, he'd submitted her within minutes using superior leverage and experience. But this time, Sarah had done her homework. She'd spent hours studying Williams during other matches, noting his preferred grips, his favorite transitions, the subtle weight shifts that telegraphed his next move. When they squared off on the mat, Sarah didn't try to match his strength or out-technique his years of experience. Instead, she became a student of his patterns. Williams shot for his usual takedown, a low single leg that he'd used successfully against Rodriguez the day before. But Sarah was already moving, having recognized the setup from his stance and hand positioning. She sprawled back, denying the takedown, and as Williams adjusted his grip, she noticed something he always looked left before transitioning to his backup plan. The tell was so subtle that even Hawkins missed it from his observation position. But Sarah had been watching Williams for weeks, cataloging his habits like an intelligence analyst studying enemy communications. When his eyes flicked left, she was already countering to the right, slipping his grip, and ending up in a dominant position for the first time in any of their matches. "What the hell?" Williams muttered, genuinely surprised to find himself defending instead of attacking. Sarah didn't waste the opportunity. She'd also noticed that Williams had a habit of overcommitting when he was frustrated, abandoning his technical approach for more aggressive tactics. She began applying just enough pressure to irritate him, making him work harder than usual, forcing him to burn energy on defensive movements. Sure enough, Williams's patience cracked. He exploded upward in a burst of strength that would have overwhelmed most opponents. But Sarah had been expecting it. She rode his momentum, using his own explosive movement to transition into a submission attempt that left Williams tapping out in bewilderment. The mat went silent. Williams stared at Sarah like she'd just performed magic. "How did you?" he started, then shook his head. "I've been grappling for 15 years. Nobody reads me that well." "Lucky guess," Sarah said, but she was already looking past Williams to her next opponent. Tank Morrison was watching from across the mat, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive for the first time since she'd arrived. Word of Sarah's upset victory spread through the facility like wildfire. By dinner, every trainee knew that the librarian had submitted one of the class's most technical fighters. That evening, she sat in the common area with her notebook, ostensibly reading a tactical manual, but actually observing the men around her. Rodriguez was playing cards with Stevens and Jenkins, and Sarah noticed that Rodriguez had a tell when he was bluffing, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that preceded every major bet with a weak hand. "Whatcha writing there, Chen?" Tank's voice made her look up. The massive man was standing beside her chair, but his expression was curious rather than hostile. "Training notes," she said carefully. "Mind if I sit?" When Sarah nodded, Tank settled into the chair across from her. "That thing you did to Williams today, that wasn't luck." It wasn't a question, so Sarah didn't answer. Tank leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I've been thinking about our fight. You kept getting back up even when you should have stayed down. At first, I thought you were just stubborn, but you were studying me, weren't you? Learning my patterns." Sarah closed her notebook, meeting his eyes. "Every fighter has tells. You drop your left shoulder before throwing a right cross. You favor circular footwork when you're setting up combinations. And you always what?" Tank interrupted, genuinely interested. "You always give your opponents a chance to quit before you finish them. It's not tactical, it's psychological. You don't like hurting people who can't defend themselves." Tank sat back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his scarred face. "Damn, you really were paying attention." He paused, studying her with new respect. "You know what your problem is, Chen? I'm sure you're going to tell me. You're trying to fight like us instead of fighting like you. Williams is a grappler, so you out-grappled him. But that's not your strength. Your strength is seeing things the rest of us miss." Before Sarah could respond, Rodriguez appeared at their table. "Mind if I join the strategy session?" he asked, pulling up a chair. "Because I just lost $20 to Stevens, and I'm pretty sure he was cheating." "He wasn't cheating," Sarah said. "He was counting cards. He's got an eidetic memory for number sequences, probably why he was so good at demolitions work. But he has a tell when he's calculating odds. He taps his index finger against his thumb in patterns that correspond to probability percentages." Rodriguez stared at her. "You figured that out from watching him play poker?" "I figured that out from watching him calculate blast radii during explosives training. The finger tapping is the same pattern." Tank laughed, a genuine sound of appreciation. "Jesus, Chun, you're like a walking behavioral analysis unit. Can you read people this well too? Tell us in the comments." Over the next few days, Sarah's reputation began to shift. Instead of being seen as a liability, she became something more valuable, a tactical asset who could read opponents like open books. During sparring sessions, she started calling out her opponents' next moves before they made them, frustrating experienced fighters who'd never been so thoroughly analyzed. The real test came during a complex team exercise designed to simulate a hostage rescue scenario. Sarah was assigned to Rodriguez's team, along with Stevens and a former Green Beret named Parker. Their mission was to clear a multi-story building and extract a hostage while competing against 3 other teams attempting the same objective. As they approached the target building, Sarah noticed something the others missed. Tire tracks in the dirt that suggested one of the opposing teams had already positioned themselves for an ambush. The tracks were fresh, and the pattern indicated they'd used the building's rear entrance. "Contact left," Sarah whispered into her radio, just as Tank's team opened fire from a concealed position. Her early warning allowed Rodriguez's team to take cover and return fire effectively, but Sarah was already thinking 3 moves ahead. She'd been watching Tank's team during previous exercises and knew their preferred tactics. Tank would try to pin them down with suppressing fire, while Williams flanked from the right. It was a solid plan that had worked in their last 2 exercises, But Sarah had a better one. "Rodriguez," she whispered. "Give me 30 seconds, then lay down covering fire on the second floor windows. Stevens, when I give the signal, breach the rear entrance. Parker, you're with me." "What's the plan?" Rodriguez asked. Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar rush of putting together a complex puzzle. "We're going to use their own tactics against them." She'd noticed that Tank's team always used the same communication protocols, the same hand signals, the same movement patterns. They were creatures of habit, and habits could be exploited. Sarah led Parker in a wide circle around the building, using terrain features she'd memorized during their initial reconnaissance. She knew exactly where Williams would position himself for his flanking maneuver because she'd watched him use the same approach in 3 previous exercises. When Williams appeared exactly where Sarah had predicted, Parker was waiting for him. The simulated firefight was brief and decisive. Williams never saw it coming. With their flanking element neutralized, Tank's team was vulnerable to the same tactic they'd been planning to use. Sarah coordinated a perfectly timed assault that caught them in a crossfire, eliminating Tank's entire team without losing a single member of her own. The exercise ended with Rodriguez's team successfully extracting the hostage, while the other 3 teams were still fighting each other in the building's lower floors. During the debrief, Hawkins studied the tactical replay with obvious interest. "Outstanding work, Team 2. Rodriguez, your coordination was flawless. Stevens, excellent breach technique. Parker, good fire discipline." He paused, his pale eyes finding Sarah. "Chun, that was some of the finest tactical analysis I've seen in 20 years of training. You anticipated every move the opposing teams made." Tank, who'd been eliminated early in the exercise, raised his hand. "Sir, how did she know where we position ourselves?" "We use standard tactics." Hawkins looked at Sarah expectantly. She stood up, feeling the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on her. "Standard tactics become predictable tactics," she said. "Every team here has preferred methods, favorite positions, habitual responses to specific scenarios. Team 1 always uses the same flanking pattern. Team 3 favors vertical movement over horizontal. Team 4 relies too heavily on suppressing fire and doesn't adapt when it's ineffective." She gestured to the tactical display, showing the building layout. "The key isn't being stronger or faster than your opponents. It's knowing what they're going to do before they do it." The room was silent for a long moment. Then Tank started clapping, slowly at first, then with genuine enthusiasm. One by one, the other trainees joined in until the entire class was applauding. For the first time since arriving at Blackwater Ridge, Sarah Chen felt like she belonged. When was the last time strategy beat brute force in your life? Week 6 brought a shift in the training atmosphere that Sarah could feel like electricity in the air. Hawkins had been watching her with the intensity of a predator studying prey, and his pale blue eyes seemed to catalog every move she made during training exercises. The change became apparent during Monday morning's advanced weapons handling course. Sarah had consistently scored in the top 3 for marksmanship, her steady hands and analytical mind translating well to precision shooting. But today, Hawkins introduced a new element: stress inoculation through simulated combat scenarios. "Real gunfights don't happen on static ranges," Hawkins announced to the assembled class. "Your heart rate spikes to 180 beats per minute. Your fine motor skills deteriorate, and your vision tunnels. Today, we're going to see how you perform when your body is flooded with adrenaline." The course was diabolical in its simplicity. Trainees had to navigate an obstacle course while being pursued by instructors firing simulated ammunition, then engage multiple targets while under time pressure and physical stress. Most of the men struggle with the transition from control range shooting to combat marksmanship, their accuracy dropping significantly under pressure. Sarah's turn came last. As she approached the starting line, she noticed Hawkins positioning himself as one of the pursuing instructors, something he hadn't done for any of the other trainees. The message was clear: she was getting special attention. The whistle blew, and Sarah sprinted into the course. Immediately, she heard the sharp crack of simulated gunfire behind her as Hawkins and 2 other instructors began their pursuit. Her heart rate spiked, but instead of panicking, Sarah's analytical mind kicked into overdrive. She'd watched every other trainee run this course and had identified the optimal path through the obstacles, where others had tried to muscle through barriers. Sarah used momentum and technique. Where they had taken direct routes that exposed them to simulated fire, she used cover and concealment. By the time she reached the shooting portion of the course, she'd gained precious seconds on her pursuers. The targets were arranged in a complex scenario, hostiles mixed with civilians, requiring split-second identification and engagement. Sarah's first shots were clean, center mass hits on legitimate targets. But as she transitioned to the next firing position, she heard Hawkins's voice behind her, closer than expected. Time's running out, Chun. In the real world, hesitation gets people killed. The psychological pressure was immense, but Sarah had learned to compartmentalize stress during her intelligence training. She continued engaging targets with methodical precision, her shots finding their marks even as simulated gunfire erupted around her. When the final buzzer sounded, she'd achieved a perfect score, the first trainee to do so under the stress conditions. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Hawkins looked surprised as he examined the targets, each one showing precise shot placement despite the chaotic conditions. "Outstanding," he said finally, but there was something in his voice that Sarah couldn't quite identify. "Chin, you just outperformed every operator in this class under combat stress conditions." But the real test came the next day during advanced hand-to-hand combat training. "Chun," Hawkins called out with a training knife in his hand, "I want to see you demonstrate the disarmament technique we just learned." "Not with Jenkins," he said as she started toward her usual partner. "With me." The training area fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every movement ceased. 20 elite operators turned to stare at Sarah with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. "The scenario is simple," Hawkins explained, holding up the training knife. "I'm an armed attacker. You're unarmed. Your objective is to disarm me and neutralize the threat." Tank stepped forward, his expression troubled. "Sir, maybe I should—" "I didn't ask for volunteers, Morrison." Hawkins cut him off, his pale eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Chun has been performing exceptionally well in all our training scenarios. I want to see how she handles a more challenging situation." Sarah felt the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on her as she walked to the center of the mat. This was clearly some kind of test, though she wasn't sure what Hawkins was trying to prove. "One more thing," Hawkins said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow made his words more menacing. "The technique I taught you today is designed for operators who outweigh their attackers. You're going to need to be more creative." Sarah took a deep breath and settled into a defensive stance. She'd spent weeks studying Hawkins during demonstrations and training exercises, cataloging his movement patterns and preferred techniques. He was faster and stronger than any opponent she'd faced, but he was also predictable in certain ways. "Ready?" Hawkins asked, and Sarah could see the predatory gleam in his eyes. Time dilated as Hawkins launched his attack. Sarah's analytical mind, honed by weeks of observation and combat, processed the incoming threat in microseconds. She'd watched Hawkins demonstrate knife techniques dozens of times, had cataloged his preferred angles of attack, his footwork patterns, the subtle tells that preceded his movements. Hawkins came in fast and low, a reverse grip knife thrust aimed at her solar plexus, a killing blow that would have dropped most opponents instantly. But Sarah had seen this exact attack during his demonstration with Rodriguez 2 days earlier. Instead of backing away or trying to block the attack, moves that would have played into his strengths, Sarah did something that violated every self-preservation instinct. She stepped forward into the attack. The movement was counterintuitive, dangerous, and absolutely perfect. By closing distance instead of creating it, Sarah negated Hawkins' reach advantage and put herself inside a striking arc where the knife couldn't generate full power. Her left hand shot up to intercept his wrist, not trying to stop the blade, but redirecting its trajectory past her body. Hawkins' eyes widened slightly, the first sign of surprise Sarah had ever seen from the legendary instructor. But Hawkins hadn't survived 22 years in special operations by being predictable. As Sarah attempted to control his knife arm, he pivoted smoothly, using his free hand to drive an elbow toward her temple. Sarah had been watching Hawkins long enough to recognize his counterattack patterns. When his initial strike was intercepted, he always followed with the same sequence: pivot, elbow strike, then a knee to the midsection. As Hawkins pivoted for his elbow strike, Sarah was already moving, using his momentum to execute a throw that sent the instructor's superior weight and strength working against him. She stepped through his pivot, hooked her leg behind his, and used his own forward motion to drive him off balance. The throw wasn't perfect. Hawkins was too experienced to be completely caught off guard, but it was enough as he stumbled backward, fighting to maintain his footing. Sarah's hand closed around his wrist in a grip that combined leverage with precise pressure point manipulation. The knife clattered to the mat. For a heartbeat, the training area was absolutely silent. 20 elite operators stared in stunned disbelief as their legendary instructor stood empty-handed, off balance, and thoroughly outmaneuvered by the woman they dismissed as a liability just weeks earlier. Then Hawkins began to laugh. When has intelligence triumphed over force in your experience? It started as a low chuckle, then built into genuine, appreciative laughter that echoed through the training facility. Hawkins straightened up, rubbing his wrist where Sarah's grip had found the nerve cluster, and shook his head in amazement. "Outstanding," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the silence. "Absolutely outstanding." He bent to retrieve the training knife, then turned to face the assembled class. "Gentlemen, you just witnessed something remarkable. Chen didn't try to out-muscle me or out-technique me. She outthought me. Chen, explain to the class what you just did." Sarah took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. "You always attack with the same initial pattern. Reverse grip thrust to center mass, followed by a pivot and elbow strike if the first attack is intercepted. Your footwork is consistent, and you commit fully to each movement. So you studied my patterns and exploited them." "Yes, sir. But more than that, I used your strengths against you. Your momentum, your commitment to the attack, your superior reach. Instead of trying to match those advantages, I turned them into liabilities." Hawkins nodded approvingly. "And the disarmament technique? The one you taught us assumes the defender is larger and stronger than the attacker. Since that wasn't the case here, I had to modify it. I used nerve pressure and leverage instead of brute force. Textbook adaptation under pressure." Hawkins turned back to class. "This is what separates good operators from great ones." Chun didn't just execute a technique. She analyzed the situation, identified her opponent's patterns, and developed a strategy that played to her strengths while exploiting his weaknesses. Tank spoke up first. "Sir, I want her on my team. Someone who can read opponents that well, who can think that fast under pressure. That's not a liability. That's a force multiplier." Stevens requested training on her pattern recognition techniques. Hawkins restructured the remaining schedule, putting Sarah in charge of tactical analysis seminars. After weeks of proving herself through pain and perseverance, Sarah had finally earned something more valuable than tolerance or grudging acceptance. She'd earned genuine respect. 8 weeks later, Sarah stood with her 19 classmates at graduation. They'd all made it through, a first in facilities history. More than that, they'd become something none of them had expected, a true team. As Hawkins called her name to receive her certification, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd arrived as an outsider, dismissed and underestimated. She was leaving as a leader, respected and valued for exactly the qualities that had once made her seem weak. Sarah Chen, Hawkins announced as she stepped forward, graduated with highest honors, tactical analysis and leadership excellence. The applause was thunderous, led by Tank Morrison, who whistled and cheered like he was at a sporting event. 6 months later, when a new female trainee arrived at Blackwater Ridge and faced the same mockery, Tank Morrison stepped forward with a photograph. Sarah Chen in full tactical gear, standing with her graduating class. "See this woman?" he said, his voice carrying across the compound. "Her name is Sarah Chen. She's the smartest operator any of us have ever worked with. She can read an enemy's moves before they make them, plan an operation better than a computer, and think her way out of situations that would kill the rest of us." He looked around at the assembled faces, some skeptical, some curious, all listening. "She didn't get here by being stronger than us or faster than us. She got here by being smarter than us. And if any of you think that makes her weak, you're about to learn just how wrong you can be." They thought intelligence was weakness. They learned it was the deadliest weapon of all. Sarah Chen didn't just graduate from elite training, she revolutionized it. Because sometimes a person who doesn't look like a warrior is exactly the warrior the world needs. What's your superpower, strength, or intelligence? Share your story below and subscribe for more incredible true stories of underdogs who changed everything. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these amazing real-life stories of people who proved everyone wrong.